Talking about a very important topic this morning, and this is something which possibly got sneaked across the line over summer, a public consultation on the topic of puberty blockers. This has been held by the Ministry of Health and it closed yesterday. What was the consultation about? What is being proposed by the Ministry of Health, and what is the best and worst case scenarios in this regard? Joining us on the program now from LifeNET, Brendan Malone. Brendan, kia ora, good morning. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, Andrew. Good to be back.
I won't be lighting fireworks to celebrate my Happy New Year, but there we go.
We're the same people in our neighbourhood, by the sounds of
it. Exactly. The topic of puberty blockers. Now, this is something which has, been hitting the headlines for a few years now. Some very concerned parents, and different parts of the world have responded differently to this. And there's been some backpedaling in some parts of the world as well. But here in New Zealand, what is being proposed by the Ministry of Health? What's the consultation about?
Well, it's kind of interesting, actually, because it's a little bit vague, funnily enough, and we're a little bit behind the eight ball, actually, in regards to looking at what other countries have done. So, for example, very liberal countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, for some number of years now, have had quite serious restrictions based on the actual evidence and data on the use of puberty blockers. And it's not just puberty blockers, it's also you have a puberty blocker medication which is intended to stop the natural onset of puberty, a very important and healthy process. And then you also often add in cross-sex hormones for quote-unquote transitioning. So it's all, and that's a whole nother area with even less research backing it. So we're a bit behind the eight ball. But what's happened here is on the back of really, I think, the CAS review that happened in the United Kingdom, which in December of last year, the UK, they actually said they've suspended indefinitely the prescription of puberty blockers to minors because there's not enough evidence, and also what we do have indicates there's some serious risks here. Now, our Ministry of Health in November of last year, so late last year, they introduced some new prescription guidelines, and those prescribing guidelines, effectively, they're not particularly strong, but they do say, look, you should only be prescribing really if you have, this is gender affirming care, they call it, as part of your practice. Then in December, they announced this review process, and there's a series of questions people could fill out online, just over a month or so of receiving submissions. The timing's a little bit strange, but also what's I think is also questionable about this is there's no guarantees. It doesn't clearly state what will happen. They're just taking this as almost like let's survey the public and public opinions and see what comes next. It doesn't give clear guidance about what they intend to do. Now, the thing is as well that with this process, it's interesting that you're surveying people and it's open to really anybody, potentially people from overseas could be making submissions and saying, well, don't ban them because I will have a bad outcome, for example. But on top of all of this, Andrew, just to I guess, complicate things a little bit more, a couple of days ago, we've had a new health minister announced, Simeon Brown. So that could change the whole dynamic of this again. So I'm hopeful, but there's no guarantees about where this will actually land or where we'll end up.
We've had our own, survey just this morning on Facebook. Puberty blockers, that's the survey, but it sounds like it's not that much less scientific than what the Ministry of Health is proposing as well. Now, the opportunity to submit to this, that has closed as of yesterday, but what would be, I suppose, the next step? As you say, new Minister of Health, is this going to be a bit of a game changer in what happens next, in your opinion?
Well, I think it could well be, actually. And I think also what you're seeing is there's an international pressure that is growing. And what's really interesting is I was recently reacquainting myself with all of the data and the literature, and you've got some really quite liberal sources who would not want a bar of, Christian sexual ethics or anything like that, who are really strong in saying these need to be outright banned. There's not only is there no good data, but the original claims that were being made are just not true. So one of the big claims that was originally made was if you didn't actually delay puberty, you would increase the risk of suicide for young people. That claim came from a survey. The survey data was handled badly. It was a faulty claim. It was always faulty. And so now that that's been corrected, in actual fact, the data shows it's the other way around. So really, I'm hopeful that we will see some serious restrictions here. And I think what would be ideal is they'd say, look, this is far too serious an intervention simply just be doing, unless you're talking about legitimate life-saving medication. The only reason you would stop a natural process in the body is to save a life. And it really is that simple. So hopefully we'll land in that particular place. And there might be a further review of how this whole area of gender therapy and people who experience bodily confusion about their gender, how they are actually treated and cared for.
Look, puberty can be pretty traumatic for most children that go through it. It's a whole new world, and it's confusing, and we don't know what's going to happen next in that regard. Some people would say that what is the harm in artificially delaying that process to help young people get their head around what it means to embrace the development of their bodies. If we're just hitting pause on this natural process, we can hit unpause after we've perhaps spent some time supporting children and how they're feeling through this. Is this just pausing the process, or does the puberty blocker process in itself cause harm to children? Brendan?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. And I've heard some people making that kind of suggestion, but to me, that's very much a product of a modern, very sort of almost empirically driven mind that would say we can just treat the human body like a machine and turn off parts of it and turn them on again. That's not how human physiology really works and human flourishing works. But more importantly, we already know that at least one of the major drugs that has been used for this particular process has serious risks attached to it. We've got data from Europe showing things like serious issues with bone density harms that are caused. There's a list of problems and growing issues related to this. And it's not really that surprising if you think, well, the human body progresses and has a natural progression of how things develop, and barring some sort of unforeseen problem that creates health issues for someone, you really shouldn't interfere with that. It's not a healthy thing to interfere with the healthy development of a body. Instead, we should say, okay, for example, if you've got a young child who's dealing with precocious puberty, it comes on a little bit earlier. How do we help them journey through that rather than turn off the actual process, which is the worst way of actually dealing with it? It's better to actually say, well, let's find a way of journeying with a young person who perhaps has puberty earlier, or someone who's confused about their body, rather than intervening with the natural processes. The other thing too, Andrew, is there's really good evidence that if we don't intervene, and the studies vary, but it's somewhere between 60 to 90% of young people, once they go through puberty, the gender dysphoria resolves itself. And so there's a really good reason to actually let puberty happen in that regard.
And I suppose the point is that nobody's proposing puberty blockers to help children deal with puberty. This is all about transitioning. This is all about leading to not only hormones, but interventive surgery. The puberty blocker movement, those that are promoting this, this is promoting, well, not just puberty blockers, but surgery in children.
Yeah, and there's a whole big movement. You're right. There's an ideological capture that has gone on. And I think a lot of people initially were hesitant to speak out because perhaps they were too afraid. They were accused of being hateful or bigoted, or they were harming people. And a lot of good people didn't really speak out early on. But now it's becoming increasingly clear that there needs to be a voice saying, hey, we need to actually focus on the well-being of children, and this is not it. And can I also say, Andrew, there's a very interesting sort of contradiction, if you like, in what the Ministry of Health has sort of done here, because about 6 or 7 months ago, they issued a directive stating that it was now illegal in New Zealand to even advise people to use progesterone, which is a well-used and safe hormone. It's used to prevent miscarriage. It was illegal, and they were threatening people with jail time if they were even advising pregnant women who'd started the abortion pill process but changed their mind and then wanted to use progesterone to reverse the process and save the baby. They said that's illegal now in New Zealand. They're really strong, threatening jail time, and yet those same chemicals, progesterone, is used in transitioning. And they're claiming it was unsafe for that purpose, but it was actually safe in this area. And also the guidelines they issued in November around puberty blockers are they're far vaguer, they're not really strong, they're not as clear and concise, and they certainly weren't threatening any jail time or serious repercussions for people who didn't follow them. So it's very interesting to see the marked difference in some of these areas.
For parents who are struggling with this, and there's a demonstrable level of social contagion when it comes to children wanting to sexually transition, what advice would you give to parents who are in that space? Perhaps there are other children in the school that their children go to, and they're going through this process at the moment. Questions are being asked. How do you approach this? How do you have a conversation with young children about what this means, what the dangers are I mean, it's awkward that we're having this conversation, but better to have it than for it to be unsaid.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. You've really hit the nail on the head, Andrew, is be involved in the life of your children, be present with them and build that relationship. That's something my wife and I have really worked hard on with our kids. And you make other sacrifices to make sure that when those big sort of confusing moments arise, they see you as being like a rock that they can go to and sort of get advice. That's number one. Number two is if there are issues around gender dysphoria and confusion about their bodies, just like you would with something like, say, for example, anorexia, which is also a form of bodily dysmorphia confusion, what you do is be careful, be loving, seek good advice. And what really seems clear to me now is that the best approach is what is often called watchful waiting. Mm-hmm. You don't encourage any strong movement in a direction. You just love and get alongside your child and keep being with them present through that challenge. And what we see, as I said, in something like 60 to 90% of cases is once puberty has sort of settled down a bit, the issues resolve themselves. I think the worst thing would be to take harsh or sort of perhaps rash, poorly considered and speedy and certainly permanent decisions. I would definitely not advise halting puberty. To me, that would be not the right way to go about this. And the risks of doing that are serious because of the drugs that are involved. And some of the indications are that you could be leaving a child with lifelong issues that they had no concept of even being able to understand, so they couldn't give informed consent to themselves when they were put on these medications.
The consultation process has come to an end, sort of sneaked in over Christmas when nobody was watching. I'm sure there'll be further discussion on this. As you say, new Minister of Health. What's the next step in your understanding, or what would be the best outcome in what happens next, Brendan?
Well, I think the best outcome would be what would be ideal, actually, is if they said, we are now going to make a declaration that there is to be an indefinite suspension and of the prescribing of these to minors. And then on the back of that, we are actually going to fund a proper randomized controlled trial, which has not been done at all anywhere. And that's the best standard that you can have. And it's pretty clear what that will show. It will show there's big issues here. And then on the back of that, I think they would then issue serious guidelines and restrictions on prescribing. And I think there would also be very clear ramifications for people who violate those requirements and rules. And they do have some possibilities. Like one possibility is they say that these medications cannot be prescribed for this purpose. It would be illegal to do that in New Zealand. I think that would be the best thing. And then also we need a suite of good care options to support parents and young people who have this bodily confusion that actually help their human flourishing and don't take them down a medicalised pathway and are not ideologically motivated.
The random trials in some way seems horrific because you think, well, why would you put children through random trials?
Yeah, and I don't think it's ever likely to happen. Even experts overseas have said, well, how could you? Because you couldn't probably even get a big enough group. So it just seems to me that right from the very beginning, the very fact that someone was suggesting that we should halt and turn off a natural and very important and beautiful part of human development, straight away alarm bells should have been ringing at that point. And the fact that they weren't is troubling in and of itself.
And whilst random trials seems horrific, essentially that's what's happening in many different parts of the world, except there's no accurate measures of outcomes. We're just experimenting on children to see what happens. And hey, that's a pretty horrific scenario as well. Brendan, if people have concerns about this, if they're wanting to, the submissions have closed, can they still make their voices heard? Is there a way forward in that regard?
Well, I think the best thing for people really is there's no official channels open at this stage, but I think you should absolutely contact your local MP and make your voice heard there. Make sure that MPs are active in doing the job. Don't just leave this to bureaucrats who are not elected to make policy decisions behind the scenes. Make sure that your MP is aware of your concerns and so they can speak up on your behalf in Parliament. And I'd say also that it's important for us to have conversations with friends, with family, with workmates, and ensure that conversation is happening so that as a nation we get an outcome that is good and it's not just taken out of our hands, the final decision.
Brendan, appreciate the work that you do. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us today.
Great to be back, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.